The contents of this podcast reflect the views and opinions of the host and do not constitute medical advice. Hi, welcome back to Long COVID MD. I'm your host, Dr. Zeest Khan, a licensed and board-certified physician navigating recovery from long COVID. In the last episode, I discussed the U.S. Senate committee hearing on long COVID. Today, I'm going to do a deeper dive into what I've learned about long COVID research funding. I'm going to tell you how much money is being spent, but also how it is allocated and how it is spent. That is the key to understanding what has happened so far in long COVID research and what direction we're actually going in. Funding long COVID research enough and in the right ways is going to be the key to finding a cure. Let's get started. I'm going to use 3 sources of funding to describe different methods of allocating funds to long COVID research. I'm going to talk about RECOVER, about PAPA, and about ARC. More important than the details of the amount of money given to each one of these entities, I want you to focus on how this money is structured or the way that this money is spent. So first, let's talk about RECOVER. RECOVER stands for Researching COVID for Enhanced Recovery. It was a project established in February of 2021 and allocated $1.15 billion with a B to understand long COVID. The money was given to the Department of Health and Human Services, which the NIH is a part of, the National Institutes of Health, and then from there was distributed to labs, mostly based in universities. The primary goal of RECOVER was to understand what long COVID is. Most of the money was given to observational studies, which tried to document the symptoms of long COVID, how to define long COVID, and possible outcomes of long COVID. A relatively small fraction of the money was allocated to clinical trials or treatment trials. And today, no effective clinical treatments have come out of any of the funding of that $1.15 billion. One could argue that drug trials take a very long time to complete, and that is true. They can take years, but that's not the primary driver of why we don't have clinical treatments for long COVID from the RECOVER money. The primary reason is because the money was not spent on clinical interventions. There have only been a handful of interventions that were tested through funds of RECOVER, and those include the Paxlovid study at Stanford, which was early in the trial stopped due to, quote, inconclusive data or inconclusive results. A lot of the money that funded that study came from RECOVER, but the cost of the intervention, which is Paxlovid, was actually covered by Pfizer. Other interventions that were tested include cognitive behavioral therapy and exercise therapy, both of which may have some benefit if used appropriately. But arguably, these are not frontline treatments that are going to save patients with long COVID. They do not use what we understand about the underlying pathophysiology of this disease. And there is a fair amount of reliable research about both of these things in the MECFS data. So you could argue these methods are not necessarily helpful, appropriate, or the research is redundant. If that's not reason enough, here's another one. Depending on CBT and exercise therapy is not practical. Finding cognitive behavioral therapist for long COVID and finding an appropriately trained physical therapist to help guide you in a rehab program or a physiatrist is not easy and cannot be scaled, at least not without a long and thorough change in medical infrastructure. I took a look at the Recover Initiative's public website and reviewed the list of publications that have come out that were funded by Recover. There is a list of scientific aims that are actually numbered, and the number one scientific aim is understand the range of recovery from long COVID and changes it can cause in our body over time. That itself is telling. That is observational. That is not interventional. Number 2 aim was to define the risk factors, understand the number of people getting long COVID, and determine whether there are specific different long COVID types. So this is part of understanding long COVID phenotypes. Number 3 out of 4 is study how long COVID changes over time and how those changes may relate to other illnesses. And number 4, the last scientific numbered aim, is identify possible treatments for long COVID symptoms. I'm thinking of something that Dr. Ziad Ali said in the Senate committee hearing. He said that the effort to find solutions to long COVID must match the scope and urgency of the problem. And when we look at Recover funding, what I see is that there is scope. It's a lot of money, but the urgency is not there. And the urgency in alleviating symptoms and alleviating disability is not there. So there is reasonable reason to critique how the Recover money was earmarked. And again, that underlying critique is that much more money was allocated to observational studies than to clinical treatment trials. And without clinical research trials, we're not going to know what medications or interventions really help. Are observational studies necessary? Yes, absolutely. Observational studies help us understand the clinical presentations of the disease, help us work on clinical markers or diagnostic criteria for the disease, and help us understand outcomes of the disease and who might be at highest risk for what reason. We need to shift some focus towards interventions and practical interventions. One of the things that I really want to see more invested in is the FDA database for repurposed drugs. The FDA, or the Federal Drug Administration, has an online database where care providers can submit what they have learned about using drugs for off-label purposes. During the Senate hearing, one of the senators who has a loved one with long COVID, he said, voiced frustration at the perceived limitations that physicians have using or sort of experimenting with different drugs that exist for other purposes on their patients. And we're not talking about irresponsible guinea pigs in this situation. We are talking about relatively safe medications that have a low toxicity profile that might be of benefit to patients. Of course, the physician and patient need to have an understanding and be really responsible about this. But what I think the senator was referring to was that we as physicians working in the United States are working in a really litigious environment, and we are feeling pressure both from the corporate heads of our medical systems and upset and angry patients. I can understand why Some physicians, especially those who don't have a lot of experience with long COVID patients, but who might be seeing more long COVID patients in their offices, are hesitant to try this approach with patients. So that's what I wanted to say about Recover. It's big. It's a lot of money. It doesn't look like it was invested with a focus on treatment and alleviation of symptoms. There are a handful of clinical treatment trials ongoing. They do include the Paxlovid study at Stanford and a monoclonal antibody study at UCSF. The Recover funding has been allocated, and the Recover money has not been renewed. Next, let's talk about PAPA. Senator Cassidy, in his opening remarks at the Senate hearing, talked about how great it was that Congress renewed PAPA, and I'll tell you what he meant by that. PAPA is the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, and in 2023, it was renewed and started including money earmarked for long COVID research. As I described in the last episode, PAPA stands for the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act. It was an initiative that was started in response to the 9/11 attacks. It was actually first passed in 2006, and it funds a lot of government agencies, including agencies that were founded by the PAPA resources. PAPA also funds private sector companies. So I want to talk about PAPA because it is organized differently than Recover. Some of the private sector companies that PAPA funds includes hospitals. Hospitals get a not insignificant amount of funding through PAPA funds, and the intention is to help hospitals be ready for the next emergency. When Senator Cassidy brought up PAPA, it was in contrast to Recover, which he criticized. He essentially said, we gave this large amount of money to the Department of Health and Human Services, and they piddled it away. And it's better to put money into PAPA because PAPA funds are distributed with more government oversight, he said. And he said or insinuated that it is inherently more responsible use of money because it subsidizes companies in the private sector. So there's a couple of things here. When I was researching this, it's difficult to find, quite frankly, how much money is allocated to long COVID research within the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act from 2023. It is also difficult to find how that money is earmarked. If you know, email me, longcovidmd@gmail.com. But I do want to talk about how I interpret this from what I know. So more government oversight or more congressional oversight. The Recover money was given to a governmental agency, and a governmental agency distributed that money. So I think Senator Cassidy is a little bit misleading there, but I believe his point was that this PAPA money is distributed possibly among more than one government agency and may be giving money to more local government agencies, which can then decide how they want to spend the money. A second difference between PAPA and Recover is that PAPA is funding private sector companies. So this could include money to startups and other non-governmental companies. Could this also mean money to pharmaceutical companies? I don't think that that's unreasonable to assume. There are strengths and limitations to this kind of model for dividing up money also. Whatever your economic beliefs are, I think we tend in 2024 America to overestimate the power of the free market. But at the same time, it is very clear that university institutions and the culture at university research hubs is less innovative in many ways than smaller companies who are trying new things. I think part of this is reflected in sort of how redundant some of the research that was funded by Recover ended up being. But that's my opinion. If you want to give me your insight, I would love to hear it. The third and last funding model I want to talk about is AHRQ. AHRQ is spelled AHRQ. It is a federal agency, and it stands for Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. AHRQ has been around for a while, and their mission is to improve patient safety and the quality of healthcare for patients. AHRQ deals with, from what I can tell, the interface between a patient and the healthcare system and trying to streamline that process. They are involved in physician education as well as patient education and finding best practices in treating certain disease processes. In 2023, AHRQ's budget included, for the first time, $9 million to address long COVID. It was brought up in the Senate hearing. One of the experts asked to have it renewed. $9 million is not a large amount of money, especially when we're talking about caring for millions and millions of Americans. But that aside, let's talk about how AHRQ earmarks this money. AHRQ focuses the $9 million for long COVID in 3 areas. It is earmarked for establishing multidisciplinary long COVID clinics. There was a discussion of these fairy tale multidisciplinary clinics that I guess exist somewhere in America in the Senate hearing. But the idea of a multidisciplinary long COVID clinic is that you can go to a place and in one place see multiple specialists who collaborate and are experts in long COVID because they've been seeing a lot of patients with long COVID. And then those specialists collaborate to develop a treatment plan for you. The benefit of a multidisciplinary clinic like this is pretty evident. I mean, once you get to the clinic, you can get a lot of testing done and have healthcare workers who are working together for you. The limitation is that multidisciplinary clinics are expensive. They're not going to be everywhere, and that means not everyone is going to have easy access to them. Unless we really utilize telehealth resources, it's not easy to keep going in person to a clinic like this for follow-ups. The second way that AHRQ is spending the money is by subsidizing research on how to best deliver comprehensive, coordinated, person-centered care for people living with long COVID. The last part of the sentence is directly from the AHRQ website, and I'll link that below here too. So in addition to establishing multidisciplinary long COVID clinics, the AHRQ money, that $9 million, is going to be spent making sure that care is being delivered effectively. And then the last of the 3-pronged approach to this money is focused on educating providers at primary care practices. In the Senate committee hearing, we heard the importance of subsidizing and supporting community health clinics so that they could adequately recognize, diagnose, and treat long COVID. AHRQ is the institution that funded Project ECHO. Project ECHO was discussed at the Senate committee hearing. Dr. Michelle Harkins, from a critical care medicine physician from New Mexico, spoke on it and spoke on her experience with it. It was established to disseminate information to critical care physicians on how to treat patients with acute COVID. And it has since been broadened to help disseminate information on best practices to primary care physicians, including an effort to use telemedicine to help educate primary care physicians on how to diagnose and treat long COVID. I think funding projects like this is useful and practical. You can also scale up quite a bit because this is essentially building or enhancing healthcare infrastructure. It's going to be beneficial to us today with knowing as much as we do about long COVID, and it is theoretically going to be helpful years from now when we know more about long COVID to continue updating primary care physicians on best practices and enhancing these multidisciplinary clinics to better treat patients with long COVID. I hope the discussion of Recover, PAPA, and AHRQ gave some context to how funding works in medical research. It's not just about the size of the check, but how that money is spent. And I think we have a lot of potential in the U.S. To find answers for long COVID, but there are currently a lot of limitations as well. It is difficult for large bureaucracies to pivot, and I know it is very difficult to pass legislation that's going to help everyone, but I do think that there are certain strengths to each one of these types of funding that we should optimize and utilize as best we can so that not only can we find an understanding of long COVID physiology, but simultaneously find treatments and then implement those treatments so that it is accessible to all patients. So if you know how to do that, let me know. What are your thoughts? Thank you for listening to this episode. As we wind down, I want to remind you that you can find me on X at Dr._Zeest. That's DOCTOR_ZEEST. You can email me anytime at longcovidmd@gmail.com. Ask me a question you want answered on the podcast, or just introduce yourself and tell me your story. I love getting to know you. So thank you. You've been listening to Long COVID MD with your host, Dr. Zeest Khan. Until next time, sending you a lot of compassion, and bye for now. So as we move from talking about money to talking about advocacy groups and ideas, I want us to keep in mind that blanket checks are not the total solution. The funding has to be used appropriately. This really is going to require a concerted effort between researchers, patients, and government entities.